Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. Now, there are libraries filled with discussion and commentary about command, but very little about control. And given the growth in C2 systems in headquarters, I think we need to consider how we effectively synchronise between key functions of command and control. Do we even understand why we put control measures into the C2 taxonomy a few decades ago? My aim is to open the conversation up, since we haven't had a serious debate about this since the 1980s. I'm Peter Roberts, your host, as we talk to operators, commanders, technical geniuses, academics, and those from industry who've been thinking about different aspects of C2 for a while. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
In this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the command element of C2 over history and not just contemporary experiences. Why? Well, the last time we experienced great power conflict was in World War II, and more recent Western experiences, and perhaps our assumptions and biases, have been bent out of shape by quite a few small wars in the last 30 years, conflicts in which we've not been seriously challenged. If you read accounts from the previous periods of great power competition, or indeed previous periods of high-intensity conflict, you'll see a remarkably different set of concerns, a different set of processes developed over long wars and not short ones, where the processes had been tested, found wanting, and then reinvented. There's a danger that these don't even exist in corporate memories now, especially since today's political and military leaders tell us that history doesn't have much to teach us or no relevance in the world today. I sense there are some continuities across conflict, especially in terms of C2. So in this episode, I wanted to discuss three big themes. What do good and great commanders have in common? Have they maintained situational awareness or real-time control of the battle space? Because that's quite hard to butt up against the experience of Nelson at Trafalgar, who had no real control past his initial flag hoist, or in the land domain about dynamic control, perhaps from Wellington or Napoleon. I mean, the Mongols used flag and horn signals to manoeuvre their Mingans and Tumans, and Henry used flags and runners at Agincourt. Schwarzkopf headquarters sent tens of thousands of messages a day back in 1991. And there's near constant control exercised by headquarters today. Perhaps it's a little different in Ukraine. The second point I wanted to get to was the trust and interaction of political and military commanders. How much was based on detailed understanding of what was actually happening in the campaign, and how much was left to this comment of "you do the fighting and I'll do the talking" made by UK Prime Minister David Cameron? And thirdly, is there an additional complication about command and control when coalition allies are involved? Does the sharing of entire campaign design work between allies to reduce frictions, or is the reality that people only need to know parts of it sometimes? That was all really clear in my mind when I said it out, but now I've said it out loud, it seems like a big ask to cover in 45 minutes. Fortuitously, I'm joined by someone who has probably forgotten more about command and control in military circles across history than I have ever read about. Professor Michael Clarke is a former boss of mine at RUSI, a London-based think tank, where he was Director General between 2007 and 2015. And prior to that, he was at King's College London as their Deputy Vice Principal, Director of Research, where he also established the Centre for Defence Studies. Now, Mike is really well known internationally, not just in the media, but also because he's worked all over the world with some seriously august institutions. And since 1905, Mike has also been advising parliamentary bodies, not just in the UK, all over the world. Notably, I guess for the UK audience, as special advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee. And then he's been appointed to various things like the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, or the Institute for Public Policy Research as a Security Commissioner, and as the Prime Minister's National Security Forum in pursuit of the National Security Strategy, which they launched in 1998. He was also appointed, away from political circles towards military ones, to the UK Chief of Defence Staff Strategic Advisory Panel in 2010. Now, Mike has written numerous papers. He's a regular commentator and expert for international medias, notably over the past year for Sky News. He's got a deep knowledge of commanders and leaders across history, but also, given his own experience, political and military leaders in contemporary times. It's that blend and expanse that I hope that we can put in these discussions and help us to really shape some of the context. Mike, welcome to the show. I've made some broad sweeping generalizations in my introduction, but I guess my first question is this. Are there continuities among successful commanders across history?
Yes, Peter. No, it's very nice to talk to you again, I have to say. We don't get to talk often enough, so it's nice to have this conversation. And I think the answer is yes. The study that I've just finished and have concluded, and it's off to the publishers now, is about British military commanders. And it's a broad historical sweep. It goes from Boadicea to Bomber Harris. So it's a modest little project, and writing sort of biographical essays on all of these people. And as an analyst, I can't resist the temptation to try to say, well, what does it all mean? What does it all add up to? Really, I'm only telling the stories of these people, but I can't resist the temptation to try to analyze as well. I've concluded in this study that there's 4 or 5 commonalities between the most successful and some of the least successful of the commanders I'm looking at. And so just thinking them through, I mean, one of them, the most obvious, is the clarity of objectives. Successful commanders are very clear about their objectives. Some commanders are quite successful without being sufficiently clear because circumstances favor them. They get the luck. But I mean, one issue is, do commanders understand the difference between, as it were, achieving a geographical objective and clearing the enemy out of it, as opposed to destroying the enemy? If you look at Haig in the First World War, Douglas Haig, he always had this view that the job of the Western Front generals was to destroy the enemy. You had to destroy them. And of course, that became the justification for a policy of attrition. He said, we have to break the German army, not just throw it out of France and Belgium. We've got to break it. Bill Slim in Burma, same sort of thing. Whereas other commanders were happy enough to try to, as it were, recover Burma in this great campaign of 1943, 44, and 45. Bill Slim, who was the architect of it all, also had this sense that we don't just need to push them out, we've got to break them as an army. That was very clear objectives. And to do that, he built the 14th Army, the best army that Britain ever had in the Second World War. It was undoubtedly the best army. And it was the last great imperial army that Britain fielded. Very imperial, contained so many different nationalities. You know, there were 30 different meal structures for the 14th Army, and they delivered 3 meals a day in 30 different menus because of all the nationalities who were fighting for it. And Bill Slim and his commanders organized that, made it work. But his job was to break the Japanese. Similar sort of thing. You look at the Battle of Jutland. Jellicoe at Jutland, Admiral Jellicoe, his job was not to lose the Grand Fleet, not to lose British sea power, not to actually allow the Germans to get on top of the Grand Fleet ever. Whereas Beatty, his battlecruiser commander, wanted to beat the German high seas fleet. He wanted to destroy them. Now, whether he was right or not to do that, the fact is that Jellicoe was criticized for not pressing the advantage at Jutland. But what Jellicoe wanted to do was to make sure that they, as it were, pushed the high seas fleet back, which they did. In the Battle of Jutland, the high seas fleet only engaged twice in that whole confused battle, twice for 10 minutes each, because after 10 minutes of pounding with the Grand Fleet, they turned away both times. They couldn't hold it. And yet they escaped in a way that Jellicoe wasn't so unhappy about, although he was criticized so much for it later on. But from Jellicoe's point of view, the outcome of Jutland was better than the Battle of Trafalgar, because after Trafalgar, the British fleet was in a dreadful state and was not up and running again for some time. And the French, after Trafalgar, were able to reconstitute their fleet, which they did. They just built more ships. After Jutland, the gates to the Atlantic remained firmly shut. The high seas fleet could not get into the Atlantic between the United Kingdom and Norway. That gate and the gate in the Channel was firmly shut. And Jellicoe was ready. When he got back to Scapa Flow and Rosyth, he signaled the Admiralty after reviewing his fleet. He said, we're ready to go again at 4 hours' notice. They could have gone out again that night. So in that respect, the outcome of Jutland was better than the outcome at Trafalgar. But it was all around what were the right objectives. So a commander has got to have the objectives that they think are strategically relevant. And there's lots and lots of other examples.
On that one, Mike, is that because there is a philosophical view that differs from each of those commanders? So, you know, Jellicoe and Beatty, one which was almost to live to fight another day, to be prepared to take on the enemy again. It was about longevity. It was about endurance and resilience. And those that understood in a different way the need to devastate the army such that it would never pose a threat again, and almost seeking a decisive campaign that sought to break them. Right? They're very different approaches, aren't they?
They are different approaches, and they depend on what the ultimate strategic objective is, which is why I think that leads into a sort of second commonality. The good commanders are acutely aware of the three levels of command: strategic, operational, tactical, which none of our listeners will need to be reminded about. And my sense is that the most successful commanders naturally straddle at least two of those three areas. A really good commander straddles all three. So Marlborough, for instance, was superb at all three: strategic, operational, and tactical. Wellington was very good at all three: strategic, operational, tactical. Some of them were not. So some of them, I think, like Montgomery, for instance, was really good at strategic and operational, not as good at tactical for all sorts of other reasons, and other commanders who were good at operational and tactical, but not at strategic. So I think Beatty, in the case of Jutland, he was good at the operational and the tactical level, although he made lots of tactical mistakes, as it happens at Jutland, but he had a tactical sense. But he wasn't as good at the strategic level, whereas Jellicoe was. And so that second element that I would add to good command is those commanders who can straddle at least two of those three levels. The best of all straddle all three. They naturally have a sense of all three levels. And some commanders, like you take, I don't know, Edward III or the Black Prince back in the medieval period, they were just tactical. They had no operational sense, absolutely no strategic sense whatsoever. Henry V was interesting. He sort of ducked in and out in that, I mean, Agincourt was a tremendous failure. It was a fabulous battle for him. But remember, the whole campaign had failed. He'd gone to Harfleur. He'd spent so long at Harfleur in the siege that the political conditions in France changed. And so he had nowhere to go. And what he was trying to do was to escape with his army, making it look as if he was looking for a fight, but not actually having to fight. So they moved from Harfleur up towards Calais. The French were able to close the fords over the Seine. And so he couldn't cross the river. So he got pushed further and further away from Calais. By the time he could cross the river, he was then over 100 miles away. So then they were marching to Calais, and the French blocked their path at Agincourt. And what Henry was trying to do was to escape without having to fight, because his whole campaign had collapsed, because he was never sure what the hell he was trying to do. Agincourt was a fabulous victory for him. And on the basis of that, he then launched another assault in 1417, did the same thing again with 10,000 fresh troops. And because the political conditions in Paris had changed fundamentally in those 2 years, he was then brilliantly successful. And again, he didn't really know what he was trying to do. And in 1422, he suddenly has what 5 previous monarchs had never been able to achieve. He was King of England, and he was about to be King of France. If he hadn't died, he would have been King of France as well. And he was within weeks of that being the case. But it didn't happen, because history just doesn't turn that way.
But it's not peculiar to British commanders necessarily to cover all those, is it? You know, just thinking about Eisenhower, who would do strategic and operational really well, but really no one would have put him in tactical command of much. Equally, his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, brilliant at strategic and operational, but really not much cop at the tactical level at all. And you're right, if you cover those two, then you do well enough. But it's keeping them within the two that plays your expertise, I guess, right? Rather than trying to venture into the third, which then gets you in real trouble, like Patton, perhaps.
It is, unless you naturally cover the third, all three. And as I say, Marlborough did, because he had a sense of what Britain's interests were in the Wars of the Spanish Succession, which is where he made his name. He had a tremendous sense of the ground, the operational level, what could and couldn't be achieved. I mean, Marlborough and Montgomery are kind of bookend, sort of an arc of British history, because Marlborough at Blenheim, that great march to the south and the Battle of Blenheim, established Britain as a great European military power able to operate independently. So British military power was something to be taken notice of after Blenheim. And that arc continues all the way to Montgomery at Alamein. And that was the last great battle in which Britain acted more or less independently, British and Commonwealth forces. And after Alamein, Britain was never again able to exert its military strength on the continent independently. And after Alamein, Montgomery was having to deal with allies. And the point is, he was hopeless at dealing with allies because of the sort of person he was. And so he relied on other people like Alexander, Harold Alexander, who was the commander of 15th Army Group and was Montgomery's superior, at least in this respect. Alexander was good at dealing with the Americans. Montgomery was terrible at dealing with the Americans. Whereas Marlborough, he could deal with his allies. He could put that strategic, operational and tactical level together, which he did brilliantly at Blenheim. Come Alamein, the other end of the historical arc, Montgomery was brilliant at that strategic and operational level until he had to work with allies. And then he was actually a commander who had to be controlled. He was a commander who had to be compensated for by other people. And so that ability to operate across those three levels is really important, I think, in looking at the difference between good and less good commanders. And a couple of other things came out as well. I think commanders have got to have what I call emotional intelligence. And talking about Montgomery always brings that out. It's a sort of emotional military intelligence, which is to say Montgomery was good at this. He understood that he was dealing with a conscript army. He understood that he was dealing with citizen soldiers who wanted to get this war over and get home. And so he knew that he mustn't squander their lives, as he had seen in the First World War. He knew that they could only achieve certain things. So firepower and armament, use of the armor was really important. And that's why his tactics were relatively cautious, because he didn't throw his troops, as were in crazy frontal assaults, expecting them all to be brave, because he knew they weren't. And so his understanding of what you could and couldn't achieve with the troops that you had was really important. And I call that a sort of emotional military intelligence. I think Bill Slim had it as well. He knew what his troops could achieve. And of course, Bill Slim, wonderful commander that he was, he spoke 3 languages himself. He spoke Urdu and Pashto. He could discuss things one-to-one with his soldiers, not just his British soldiers. And that emotional military intelligence is also apparent when people can get into the mind of the enemy. It's not just understanding your own soldiers, but having a sense of what the enemy is and is not capable of. And again, some commanders have it and some don't. And I suspect that some of that emotional military intelligence comes from early career. I've been struck in the studies I've been doing at how many of these successful commanders achieved prominence early on as young officers, very often, by acts of gallantry. That's what brings them to notice. And most of them are carrying wounds. Doesn't mean to say you have to be wounded to be emotionally intelligent, but most of them could, as it were, draw from their own experiences in previous wars, the realities of military life and the realities of battle. I mean, Montgomery was very close to death. I mean, a grave was dug for him when he was caught out in the open by a sniper, and he lay all day out in the open with a dead soldier who tried to rescue him lying on top of him and taking more snipers' bullets into this corpse that he lay all day underneath until he could be pulled in overnight. And he was so near to death, they dug a grave for him, but he sort of clung on to life and came back and so on. Harold Alexander was wounded several times on the Western Front. And though he had a sort of very schoolboyish attitude to war, but they all knew what it felt like. I mean, Beatty and Jellicoe that we were talking about, they were both in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, both of them wounded. Again, Jellicoe very seriously wounded, Beatty badly wounded in the arm and very affected by it. Most of these people were carrying experiences, and in some cases wounds, from previous conflicts. And I think that has some connection to what I call emotional military intelligence, of understanding the nature of what you're asking troops to do when it comes to real battle, whether it's land, sea, or air. So I think all those things are interesting. Courage is important. The courage of a commander, having demonstrated some physical courage, some personal courage, commanders also have to demonstrate sort of battlefield courage, courage in crisis, courage to not seem to go to pieces. And there are lots of examples of other commanders in difficult situations at Dunkirk in 1940, before the invasion in 1944. I won't name them, but certain commanders were seen to be just bags of nerves, just simply have lost the will to make decisions. And indecision is the worst thing a commander can suffer from. I mean, some commanders make clear decisions which turn out wrongly, but indecision spreads through the command structure. It spreads to the troops. And I remember one British commander, current commander, I was talking to for this work. He said to me, "You can only ever be yourself." He said, "The troops all know you. They know who you are. And you can be a type A personality, a type B personality. You can be an extrovert, an introvert. It's no good trying to be somebody different. They know who you are. And so you've got to aim to be the best version of yourself. You give your personality to the command structure you're part of. And if you're indecisive, or if you look as if you are struggling to make decisions, or if it looks as if you're overwhelmed by it, or if it looks as if you've got yourself too exhausted, that too spreads itself through the command structure." And that was an interesting observation. And that goes both for the tactical level, if you're talking about company command, right through to army command.
Just linking back to that, both those things, courage and the emotional intelligence, it's tempting to see those as attributes that make your troops love you. But that's not what we're saying here, is it? I mean, I'm not sure if you look at Wellington, his troops didn't love him. They respected him, But it's not necessary to be adored by your troops in the way that Monty perhaps was and Slim. They were really adored by their troops. But you get great commanders who aren't absolutely adored by them, but there's a respect there, which is a different thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the key issue. Respect. And the respect you get is usually by being a winner. Troops will do anything if they think they're being commanded by somebody who's going to win. Everybody wants to be on the side of the winners. And so you can gain respect through success, even if you're a rather difficult commander. I mean, Jellicoe was a successful commander at sea. I mean, he was not a very good First Lord of the Admiralty subsequently, but he was a very good commander at sea. And he had immense respect because of the way in which he treated people. People didn't like him terribly, whereas they all loved Beatty because he was this outgoing character. He was a sort of a cavalier approach. But I mean, Jellicoe was a lot more successful than Beatty in general. So, yeah, respect is important. Affection and respect are very good when they go together. But the most important attribute for any leader is that they're perceived as a winner.
Now, all that reflects on a great study of history, right? And I said in the introduction that that's what I wanted, is some of that historical stuff. If we shift forward to today, and you've got people like, say, a very different environment. I think fighting retains much of the nature it always has. But there are differences today. Do those things sort of just trade straight onto today? How has the command environment changed for people today in a way that perhaps we can't just simply impose on historical examples?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. I mean, I think you and I would both agree that the nature of warfare doesn't change. Warfare is a competition using lethal force for the imposition of political will of some sort. That's the nature of warfare, and that goes through 3,000 years of recorded history. But the characteristics of warfare, the way in which that fundamental competition takes place, changes all the time. And what we're looking at now are tremendous changes. And I think for the commander now, the commander has got to deal with an environment in which both the nature of the problem is both expanded and compressed. It's expanded in some areas and compressed in others. So to give it its sort of headlines, I'd say it's expanded in a physical, temporal existence. So warfare now goes from space right down to the trenches. We see that in Ukraine. So there is an element of space war in what's happening in Ukraine. Look at the importance of the Starlink satellite system for command and control among Ukrainian forces, which can come right down to a soldier's own personal phone, smartphone. And yet it also goes down to the old traditional behavior and understanding of trench warfare and the lessons that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers learned about keeping yourself fit and active in the trenches. So in one sense, it's expanded temporally. It's expanded between, I would say, fighting and thinking, in the sense that you don't just have to fight battles now or fight campaigns now. You have to fight what lies behind them. And so every campaign is now also a campaign with a narrative in it, with not just a propaganda element. That's a very old-fashioned way of looking at it. But we talk about, the battle of cyberspace, the battle of the narratives. So it's just gone from fighting to fighting and thinking. It's expanded like that. And I think it's expanded in that we don't just now fight for societies, you fight in societies, in the sense that every war is now, in a sense, a civil war, because the campaign itself is also about affecting very directly the way in which the enemy's society thinks about it, the way your society thinks about it. And it isn't just a question of creating a reality which that society has got to adjust to or recognize. There's a way of fighting that war inside that society. Witness all of the subversion that goes on all sides using social media in order to affect the ways in which societies think about what they're doing. So in all those ways, I think the task for the commander has expanded both temporally in terms of how you fight and in terms of where you're fighting. You're fighting in your own society, in your opponent's society, and you're fighting on the battlefields at the operational level as well. That's one side of it. But the other side of it is that everything's very compressed. And this is where I'd say the geometric shape is now a very peculiar shape that's very hard to describe. So it's compressed in terms of time. I mean, if you think about, say, General David Richards in the Sierra Leone case in 1999, 2000, in principle, he had to do all the same things that the Duke of Wellington had to do. So he had to deal with allies. He had to deal with different elements of the services. He had land, sea, and air. He had to deal with the situation as he saw it on the ground. He had to think about losses. He had to think about resources. Obviously, it was a much smaller operation in Sierra Leone than, say, the Peninsular Wars. But Wellington had months and years to deal with those things. David Richards had weeks and days to deal with those things. And commanders now may have only hours and days to deal with things which Second World War commanders had weeks and months to deal with. So there's a great compression of time. There's a compression of communications. in the sense that we know that although sometimes modern communications break down, this plethora of communications, you mentioned Schwarzkopf in Desert Storm, using the communications media in order to have tentacles into every tactical area if they wanted. I remember at the time, Tom King was British Defense Secretary, and apparently in the Gulf in 1991, he visited the Gulf and he saw what the communication levels were like among American forces. And he saw how much it was that Washington could reach right into the battlefield. And he said, I want that. I want that ability. And a lot of civil servants and military officers were saying, oh, well, Minister, I'm not sure that's such a good idea. And a lot of effort went into stopping Tom King having the ability that he observed American politicians could have to influence what was going on the ground. There was a real clash of cultures. He was dazzled by the connectivity that Americans could have. Of course, we now do have that connectivity and it has to be handled very carefully.
There's a great apocryphal story back in 2003 of a Royal Navy minehunter going up the Khor Abdullah as the first Allied warship in, and it was taking a bit of small arms fire. And apocryphal or not, there was a phone call to the commanding officer from the First Sea Lord who was watching this whole thing on CNN and said, get out there, I want a bigger ensign on the back end, make it so. And I don't think the CO could quite believe what he was getting from London. So these things do happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, whether that was literally true or not, I've no idea. But that's exactly indicative of what is possible and commanders may or may not have to deal with. So, that's another thing. And then the other area of compression is the integration of the domains of warfare. If you look at what I always take to be, some say 5 domains, I think it's 6 domains of warfare. So, land, sea, undersea, air, space, and cyber. All of those domains are approaching levels of integration that would have been astonishing 20 or 30 years ago. Now, whether they can be integrated well or badly, that's the philosopher's stone of modern control. Everybody wants to integrate all levels of warfare and bring them together. In reality, the Americans are streets ahead of everybody else. In a way, it's only a game that they can really play, but we'll see. We'll see what happens to Chinese forces and see what happens to European forces. But it's what everybody pursues. And that is this willful compression of things which otherwise would sit in their natural silos. And so the technique then is to say, well, where should it be left in its silo and which bits of it need to be brought together? And so all of those are compressions. And then the one that we're still trying to get our heads around is this man-machine interface. Artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, the potential is huge. We don't really know yet how to weaponize all of these things. What we do know is that they will be weaponized by America and China, and maybe some European powers will find ways of weaponizing these things, but we don't know which aspects will be weaponized. But that really compresses the control function. At what level does the man-machine interface take place? How much time is there for the man-machine interface to make a decision? How much has to be left to the autonomous systems? How far back in the chain can you allow human decision-making to sit? If it sits too far forward in the chain, then it may be overwhelmed or you may miss good opportunities. If it sits too far back, then you're giving too much to the autonomous systems, and you may find that your country, your forces are making decisions that you would never really have made, decisions which might be either illegal or decisions which are legal but very unwise. And that's an area of compression in the control function, which we are still trying to get hold of. We're still trying to think it through. And some say it's very exciting, others say it's very dangerous, but it's certainly very new.
So all those things feel very broad and expansive. I mean, it's useful to put them into this expansion-contraction rubric. I was just thinking then about political military interactions, which historically have been entirely human to human. And they've been about the military explaining, sometimes in plain language, sometimes very technically, to the politicians about what's possible, and the politician trying to articulate what they want out of this at the end of it. And those interactions in terms of command and control over who owns what part of the problem have been constantly sources of friction. But with this new expansion and compression, the expansion of battlefield comms and situational awareness, allowing politicians in London to see what's happening at company houses in Afghanistan, or people in Kiev, President Zelensky watching what's happening on the battlefront almost in real time, down to individual soldiers, what's happening to individuals. And then there's this compression at the same time over time. Can I take this decision now? Can I defer it? What can I do? Because they've got that level of situational awareness, that level of communications, and almost a feeling of responsibility by good commanders to want to do something, whether it's political or military. Do you think that this has changed again across history? I mean, it used to be that politicians didn't go to war and that they would issue their written instructions and they would take weeks, months to arrive with a commander. And now it's instantaneous almost. Do you think that has changed the relationship in political military C2?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that political military relationship is much more delicate now than it was. It's much more volatile. I mean, there were cases in the past, of course, where politicians expressed their views and the military could or couldn't carry them out. Churchill was a very good example of a politician when he was at the Admiralty and then when he became Prime Minister, who was always trying to tell the campaign managers what they should be doing. He had all sorts of ideas, and most of them were not very practical. Dudley Pound, for instance, first Sea Lord during most of the worst part of the Second World War, he had a way of saying, never say no to Churchill, but find ways of frustrating what he wants to try to do. If you say no to him, he gets pugnacious. So don't say no, but keep pointing out the problems. And eventually he gives up on it, or he would never admit that he was wrong, but he's tacitly admits that he was wrong. And Dudley Pound, although poor man didn't survive illness during the war, he died during the war, but he had a way of dealing with Churchill because Churchill was a difficult man to say no to. There are cases like that. But in general, commanders until recent years could request a clear political intent and then get on with it. Now, of course, that political intent often changed. For instance, in the Burma campaign that we talked about earlier on, Bill Slim and Mountbatten constantly said to Whitehall, what do you want us to achieve after early 1944? Having won in that big Japanese offensive that tried to invade India eventually, they then said, okay, look, we've got it now. We've got back to where we were. What do you want us to do next? And they couldn't get a word out of Whitehall because Whitehall was fixated on the D-Day landings and on the Battle of Northern Europe. And it was Slim and Mountbatten that said, okay, well, we'll do our own thing. We'll actually do what we think is best because we can't get anything sensible out of Whitehall, which just said, hold the line. They kept saying, hold the line and look for opportunities. So they forgot about the holding the line bit and just looked for opportunities. And those opportunities came when they actually liberated Rangoon in a classic operation that turned out to be a classic air, sea and land combined operation. It was a brilliant piece of tactical maneuvering. And Whitehall, I wouldn't say they didn't know about it, but they kept being presented with successes, fait accompli successes. So they sort of shrugged and said, oh, fine, well done. And then turned their attention back to Northern Europe, which is what was obsessing everybody. So there are cases where the military have a right to be given political objectives and get on with it, or where they're not given clear political objectives, but establish their own objectives and say, well, you didn't tell me I couldn't do this. And that was where John Moore fell apart, of course, in the Peninsula, because he had very vague objectives. He overinterpreted them, got himself in a mess, and then the retreat to Corunna cost him his own life and basically the loss of all the equipment of the only field army that Britain had. I mean, the army got away. It was a rabble by the time it got away from Corunna, but they lost all of their equipment. I mean, like Dunkirk, it was a great heroic defeat. But these days, the problem is slightly different because those political objectives can be adjusted day in, day out. And we saw that, I think, in the Libya crisis of 2011, when David Richards is very clear now, I think, in retirement, that he said he did have a good relationship with David Cameron, but he constantly was pushing for consistency. What did the politicians want? Were they trying to actually get rid of Gaddafi? Was it regime change, even though they didn't want to say it? Or was it the protection of Libyan citizens that Gaddafi was threatening? What were they really trying to do? And I think David Richards, I know, got quite frustrated because he felt, if you give us an objective, we'll do it. But if you keep changing the objectives on a day-by-day basis, or the cabinet or the National Security Council, as it then was, keeps coming back with, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And his argument was, look, give me the objective and I will get on with it. But if you keep on telling me that the objective is not being achieved because you think you've got better tactics, we're not going to get anywhere. And that was that frustration that you mentioned at the beginning when David Cameron said to him, you do the fighting, I'll do the talking. I think David Richards' response to that, whether he said it or not, was, if only that were true, Prime Minister. If only you would.
There's a really difficult challenge, isn't it? I mean, because now you get people trying to express all the time, campaign ends, which of course is a ridiculous statement because campaigns never end. Everything keeps changing constantly. But you often end up today with statements of a political end state, which are just too bland and in many ways too fixed. And at the other end, you get something that is just too dynamic. It's too fast changing. You can't adapt to it in time. And there seems to be this tension here, which lives right at the top of the shop in that political military relationship. But I guess it's even more complex where you talk about allies, when you've got allies on the same page who might want the same sort of fuzzy end state, but again, think about going at it in very different ways, you end up with a sort of very different command and control system with allies, both for the commander at the top, but also the political level, I'm guessing.
Yes, and the whole allied dimension, again, it's not new. It's existed all the time back in the last 400 or 500 years, but it becomes much more sensitive in the modern era because all of the allies have got their own public opinions. They've got their own political systems, which look at what's happening and can see it now in real time. And so allied relations are always very, very critical. And we've seen that in all of the operations of the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, Western operations are almost always, the interesting exception of the Falklands War of 1982. I mean, all of our operations are coalition operations of one sort or another. And there's always a pecking order amongst allies. And there is always this sense, and one of the things, this goes back to the Second World War. Quite a lot of Britain's forces in the Second World War after 1942 were configured in such a way as to give us some influence within allied circles. And so you have to include forces that do this or do that, or forces of a certain size to be taken seriously, to actually win some political influence in the whole process. And that is extremely sensitive now, which is why commanders, we do require them to be super commanders. Somebody used to call them super Ruperts. We need these people who are able to be politically aware, to be significantly good at allied relationships, and still be good technical commanders, still have all the attributes that we talked about in the earlier part of this podcast. And that's asking for an awful lot. And do we train people to do that? No, we don't. I mean, we talk about it and we recognize it, but it's very hard to bring people on to possess all those sorts of skills. But at least I suppose now we do recognize it. And some systems, the American system, I think, is better at bringing commanders on to the very top who are good across all of those areas. We're not as good at doing it, although some of those people do emerge. But they don't emerge because we train them. I think they emerge because they're just those sorts of people and they're successful because they're able to tick off the requirements of modern command, which are really now very considerable.
And they do emerge at the time for some reason. I mean, as you say, it's not because we train them. We like to have a lot of accountants who can run spreadsheets and keep the budget online and do the transformation and all that other stuff that has to happen. But when it comes to the fight, people pop out. It's rare that we identify them a long time in advance and say, right, this is the person for the top, this is the person that'll do it, and help them there. They tend to emerge, and then it takes someone at the top who's really quite good at identifying these characters and putting them in the right hole.
Yeah, bringing people through. I think there's two requirements there. One is to talent spot. People at the top have got to be good at talent spotting. And again, that comes and goes with sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't, depending on personalities. So talent spotting is important. And then the other thing is sort of ruthlessness. If people can't cope, you've got to get rid of them. Not humiliate them, but they've got to be moved on. And again, you look back at successful campaigns over the last 150 or 200 years, but particularly the last 100 years, and you can see that process. When fighting starts or when something is at a critical moment, egos and careers should not matter as much, and people need to be shuffled around and moved on so that those who are talent spotted can be brought through. And of course, there are some terrible mistakes made. People who are great self-advertisers, self-promoters can come through. And so talent spotting is not a straightforward process. But nevertheless, that's what you sort of rely on, that at times of real crisis, you will be able to bring the right people high enough up the chain who've got those abilities. But do we do that consciously? No, I don't think we do. We've been relatively lucky that it has happened frequently enough from our point of view in the past. But will it continue to happen in the future? I don't know, because the pool of people that you're drawing from is getting quite small.
And smaller all the time, so it seems. Interesting to see the Israelis tend to do better, not in terms of replacing those that don't do well, but in terms of talent spotting. They've been really very successful in picking good commanders and then sifting them for people at the right level. So you tend to have a very good structure of right people at the right level in the Israeli Defense Force all the way down. The same is almost true in parts of the Iranian military. In the IRGC, for example, Soleimani coming to the top was absolutely the man that they needed at that moment. Not to agree with their action on their campaigns, but as a commander, he really was quite outstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And the danger is when you talent spot, of course, that you talent spot people who are good at the operational and tactical level, but not at the strategic level. So you've got to spot talent. And if you have to cover two of those three, you're really trying to spot strategic and operational talent, because tactical level talent, you can always find somewhere else you can bring on in other ways. I mean, as people move up the chain, they don't need to be as tactically astute as they used to have to be, but operational and strategic, that's the biggest chasm to jump. You can jump the tactical operational chasm reasonably quickly, because one does lead on to the other. If you've got a good eye for ground, you've got a good eye for tactical advantage, and you've got a good sort of emotional military sense of what can be achieved, you can move from tactical to operational just with experience. But I think you can only move from operational to strategic with something else. It's experience plus genuine talent at understanding, at empathizing with what is out there at the political level. You and I know we sort of hang around at the political level, so we know how different it is. And you and I also both know lots of examples of military professionals who are really good in the military, who are just baffled by the sheer cynicism and the sheer viciousness of the political level.
Mike, thanks for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. As usual, amazingly succinct, accessible and comprehensive. If you enjoyed listening to Mike, then you can find him on Twitter. And I'd recommend to the audience watching Mike during a talk about the Duke of Wellington on YouTube. It's my favourite video there. It's a 2015 recording of Mike talking about Wellington's victory at Waterloo. Just from those 10 minutes, you'll understand why Mike remains one of the most in-demand speakers to students, academics, military personnel and professionals anywhere in the world. His students and employees never forget his speeches and his informal remarks. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR Citaware suite.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe, leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming channels. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by Aurelius Lab as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.